It was supposed to be a routine interview, just another moment for the media to take control. But they didn't realize Barron Trump had other plans. For years, the media had fixated on one family more than any other. The Trump name was a magnet for controversy, a lightning rod for debate. Every headline, every segment, every viral tweet, his family had lived under the relentless glare of the spotlight. But there was one Trump they had never quite figured out. Barron, the youngest son, the quiet one, the one who had spent most of his life on the sidelines, away from the noise, the scandals, the fights. While the world dissected every word, every move, every breath of his father, Barron remained an enigma. Some saw him as a mystery, others as a weakness. And tonight, the world was finally going to hear his voice, not because he wanted them to, but because they forced him to. It started like any other media event. The camera crews setting up, the producers whispering in hushed tones, the bright studio lights humming with a steady intensity. But beneath the professional smiles and the carefully orchestrated routine, everyone in the room knew the truth. This wasn't just an interview, this was an ambush. And the man leading it? He was no ordinary journalist. He was a master of destruction. A veteran interviewer, famous for cutting down politicians, exposing their weaknesses, unraveling them on live television. He had a reputation built on making his guests regret ever stepping into his studio. And tonight, his target was Barron Trump. They thought they knew how this would go. A young man, new to the spotlight, untrained in media battles, sitting across from one of the most ruthless interviewers in the country. The media had done this 1,000 times before. Take the inexperienced, put them under the lights, and watch them crumble. This was supposed to be easy. But what they didn't realize was that Barron Trump had other plans. He had spent years watching, years listening, years learning. And when the time came, he wasn't going to crumble. He was going to make history. The journalist thought he had control. He had done this before, dozens of times. But what he didn't realize was that Barron had been waiting for this moment. The cameras rolled. The studio lights burned bright. And across the sleek, polished table, two men sat facing each other. On one side, the journalist, relaxed, smug, his hands folded neatly in front of him, the corners of his lips curled in a knowing smirk. He had done this before. He had destroyed seasoned politicians, corporate giants, even Hollywood stars who thought they could out-talk him. But tonight, he wasn't up against a businessman or a politician. He was up against something else entirely. A man who had spent his entire life being judged before he had ever spoken a word. And now, he was about to speak. The journalist leaned in, the smirk never leaving his face. "Your family is known for controversy." The words were slow, deliberate. "Some say your father is the most divisive leader in modern history. How do you respond to that?" It was a trap, a carefully laid one. The kind that forced the guest into a corner. Any answer Barron gave would feed into the pre-written headlines. If he defended his father, he'd be accused of bias. If he hesitated, he'd be called weak. A lose-lose scenario. At least, for most people. The audience chuckled softly, sensing the bait being laid out in front of him. The journalist had done this 1,000 times before. He expected his guest to shift uncomfortably, to search for words, to stumble. But Barron didn't move. He just sat there, still, calm, watching. And then, after a moment of silence, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and spoke. "Divisive, that's an interesting word." His voice was measured, steady, not rushed, not defensive, just thoughtful. "Would you call Abraham Lincoln divisive?" A murmur rippled through the studio. "Would you call Churchill divisive?" The journalist's smirk wavered, just for a fraction of a second. Or does that word only apply when someone stands for something unpopular with the media. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. The journalist had expected a defensive answer. Instead, he was hit with a counterattack. For the first time, he hesitated. Not much, just a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But Barron saw it, and so did the audience. This wasn't going to be easy. This wasn't going to be like the other interviews. This was something different. And for the first time, the journalist realized he wasn't in control anymore. The journalist was losing control, and he knew it. So he did what he always did. He got personal. But this time, it was a mistake. The journalist adjusted his posture, his smirk faltering just slightly. The game had changed, and he knew it. Barron had done something unexpected. He had not only deflected the attack, but turned it around. That wasn't supposed to happen. But this interviewer had built a career on controlling the narrative, and he wasn't about to lose to a 20-something-year-old who had never sat in the hot seat before. He took a slow breath, recalibrating. If politics wasn't an angle that worked, then there was another one that always did: family. Your father has been accused of dishonesty, scandals, and corruption. Are you saying he's completely innocent? The words hung in the air like a loaded gun. The journalist knew exactly what he was doing. This was no longer about Barron's thoughts or opinions. This was about making him defend something bigger than himself, something more controversial, more polarizing. It was a question designed to force him into a defensive stance, to make him flinch. The room was still, the tension thick. The audience, journalists, and camera crew waited for the inevitable hesitation, the scramble for words. But Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, an almost imperceptible smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He exhaled calm, collected. "Tell me," he said, voice steady, "if my last name wasn't Trump, would you ask me this question, or would you be more interested in what I stand for, rather than who I'm related to?" Silence. The journalist's expression hardened. The audience shifted. The question was brilliant. It wasn't a direct refusal to answer. It wasn't an outright dismissal. It was something more powerful. It was a mirror, a reflection of the bias in the room. And the journalist knew it. He had expected Barron to stumble into his trap, to get flustered, to rush to his father's defense. Instead, Barron had exposed the very nature of the question itself. A few murmurs ran through the audience. Even some of the journalist's supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Barron leaned back in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the table. "If you want to debate me on policies, let's do it. But if you're just here to attack my last name, then maybe you should ask yourself, who's really afraid of having this conversation?" The energy in the room shifted. The journalist clenched his jaw. He was losing his grip on the interview, and he knew it. But he had one last play, one final move to turn the audience against Barron. The journalist had one last move, one final attempt to break Barron. But what happened next? No one expected. The journalist knew he had to take back control, fast. If he let Barron dominate this moment any longer, the story would shift. The headlines would read differently. He needed to shut him down now. So he went for the ultimate attack. "You talk about fairness and being judged for who you are," the journalist said, his voice rising slightly. "But let's be real. If your last name wasn't Trump, you wouldn't even be here right now." There it was. The final blow, the knockout punch, the line designed to shatter any credibility Barron had built so far. It was the classic privilege argument, the one that had silenced so many before him. It was a tactic used over and over again, to make people question their worth, to reduce their voice to nothing more than their background. The audience reacted immediately, gasps, whispers, even some nods of approval. The journalist leaned back, satisfied. He had seen it work before. He had seen people shrink under this kind of attack. The weight of it, the implication that they had never earned their platform. But then Barron did something no one expected. He laughed, not nervously, not awkwardly, just a quiet chuckle, the kind of laugh that made the journalist's stomach drop. Barron leaned forward slightly, looking the journalist directly in the eye. "You're right." A ripple of confusion ran through the audience. Even the journalist blinked. Barron nodded. "If I wasn't a Trump, I wouldn't be sitting here. But you know what's funny? If I wasn't a Trump, you wouldn't be here either." Silence. "If my last name wasn't Trump, this interview wouldn't be happening. If I wasn't a Trump, you wouldn't care what I had to say." This was never about politics. It was never about fairness. This was about using my name as a headline. And the problem with that is that you never actually listened to what I had to say. The audience shifted. The murmurs turned into whispers. Even some of the journalist's supporters were staring at him now, waiting for a response. He had nothing. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the journalist had no comeback. Barron sat back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. The control was his. The power had shifted. The interviewer swallowed hard, glancing at the cameras. He had been on this stage countless times before, and never had he been the one on the defensive. The weight of it crashed down on him. He wasn't the one leading the conversation anymore. Barron was, and for the first time in his career, the journalist understood what it felt like to be completely outplayed. The cameras stopped rolling. The interview was over, but what happened next? No one saw coming. The journalist sat motionless. The lights in the studio were still blinding, the cameras still running, the silence deafening. He had spent years breaking people under pressure, watching them stumble, watching them fold. But tonight, something was different. He was the one left without an answer. The weight of Barron's words still hung in the air. The audience could feel it, the crew could feel it, and most importantly, the world was about to feel it too. The moment the broadcast ended, the internet exploded. Within seconds, clips of the interview flooded social media. "Barron Trump destroys journalist on live TV." Unbelievable moment. Barron turns the tables in viral showdown. The night the media lost control of the narrative. The headlines came in waves, each more intense than the last. People who had never spoken about Barron before were suddenly debating his performance. Some were in shock, some in admiration. Some refused to believe what they had just witnessed. Political analysts scrambled to react. Some tried to spin it. Others were forced to acknowledge what had just happened. Even longtime critics of the Trump family found themselves re-watching the exchange, stunned by the sheer composure Barron had displayed. Talk show hosts played the footage over and over again, dissecting every moment. This was not what anyone expected, one commentator admitted. "We all assumed he'd be just another figure in the background. But tonight, he became something else entirely." On Twitter, hashtags began trending almost immediately. #Barron's media, #Trump legacy continues, #Who is Barron Trump? Thousands of people debated the moment. Some called it the greatest media takedown in years. Others insisted it was just a fluke. But one thing was clear. No one could ignore Barron Trump anymore. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just known as Donald Trump's youngest son. He was something more, a force in his own right. And whether people liked it or not, the conversation had changed forever. Meanwhile, inside the studio, the journalist sat in silence, still gripping the edge of the desk. He had conducted thousands of interviews before. He had always known what to expect. But tonight, he had been outplayed. As Barron stood up from his chair, adjusting his suit cuffs, he didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply nodded once, acknowledging the stunned audience, and walked off set. No further words needed. The message had already been sent, and the world was still trying to process it. They thought he would crumble. They thought he would fall apart. But in one night, Barron Trump didn't just survive the interview, he owned it. And the real question is, was this just the beginning? The world just witnessed something historic, a moment that no one saw coming. But now, the question isn't just about what happened, it's about what happens next. Barron Trump stepped out of the shadows tonight. He did what no one expected. He didn't just survive the toughest interview of his life, he controlled it. He dictated the conversation, and he walked away, leaving the world speechless. But this is bigger than one interview. This is bigger than one viral moment. For years, the media has shaped the narrative. They've controlled the headlines, dictated who gets to be heard, and silenced those they don't want in the conversation. Tonight, that changed. But the fight isn't over. Because the real question isn't who is Barron Trump. It's what comes next. If you were as shocked by this moment as the rest of the world, then this is just the beginning. What do you think? Did Barron Trump just redefine the way the world sees him? Was this a one-time event? Or is this the first step towards something even bigger? Join the conversation in the comments below. Let's hear your take. Do you think the media will try to recover from this? Will they acknowledge what happened? Or will they try to bury it? And if you want more eye-opening moments like this one, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because this isn't just a story, it's a shift. And you don't want to miss what happens next.